Hey everybody, it's Kyle here, and welcome to a revision video. This video is pretty much, we're going to recap everything that I covered in my very first upload, but in a little bit more depth, and hopefully a little bit more detail. Now, I haven't seen that video in ages, but these are the topics that we'll be covering today. This being a multiplayer sort of, not really in depth, more of a multiplayer sort of kind of recap. We'll be covering the following topics. That's balancing. That means balancing for both sides. Level flow, and in this case, level flow for multiplayer maps, as well as complementing the gameplay and taking into account the gameplay pace. And I'll also be talking about having a solid design kit and how it can ease your level construction using static meshes. Now, I'll also be talking about a few other things, but these are the four major points that I'll be covering today. So, without further ado, let's get straight into the level design process. Okay, so here we are in Unity 3D, and before we get into my level building workflow, we're going to take a look at the final product first. So things are a little bit backwards today. So the first thing that we can see is that we have roof pieces, and we want to just turn these off for a second because we don't really need to see that. So the key things with multiplayer level design is that you need to take in, well, apart from the standard level design theories that you need to take into account, like level flow and level purpose, you also need to make sure that it is balanced. That's one of the key things when it comes to multiplayer level design, that the map is well balanced, that there's adequate cover for both sides, and that each of the areas that you can get to are easy to get to from any other given point in the world or in the map. So let's take a quick look. Let's have a virtual tour. Okay, so here we are in playtest mode, and essentially, while I'm walking around, I'm gonna go into a little bit more depth about level design, multiplayer level design balancing. So essentially, this smaller building has a lot more going for it in terms of openings and entrances, but it also has a lot more cover. Whereas the building on the other side has fewer entrances. In fact, there's one entrance there. Whoop, gotta go around this one. There's another entrance towards the side here. It's a little bit out of the way, but it's also more exposed. And you've got the other entrance here, which is very open, and it's basically a bailout point for anybody using the building. Now, what else is what makes it balanced is because this building is significantly smaller. So if we get out of play mode, and we take a look at this, we can see that this first building over here is significantly smaller than this building over here. This one. Now, I've intentionally made it so that the second story is inaccessible. It's purely there for aesthetic purposes. And the reason that I chose to do that is because there's a lot more cover when it comes to being inside. If we take a look inside, we can see that there's a lot more places to hide and a lot more places to get an advantage on anybody trying to get into the building. Now, these are the two areas, and without proper playtesting, I can't really say if it's properly balanced or not. However, I can say that the area in between, so the outdoor area with all these props scattered around, let me just turn off textured wire, put it to textured mode. All these red pieces of geometry, they're just stand-in props. They're not really the final thing. In fact, the map as it stands may or may not represent the final product. In any case, though, we can see that here in the middle, there's as much chance of a player starting from this building. They have equal chance of getting to the other side of the map as somebody who starts in this building. So really, that's what balancing in multiplayer games is all about. It's making sure that you can get from point A to any other given point in the map with ease, and more importantly, to make sure that they can get there without losing their heads in game. Now, another thing about multiplayer level design is that you need to take into account the fact that The level flow is essentially a circle, right? It doesn't end. The only way that a multiplayer game ends is if you reach a time limit or if you reach like a points limit, right? So essentially, you need to make the map a circle. That's how you should be imagining your multiplayer map. So let's take an example. Say we start at this doorway here, and we want to get to, say, we want to make a round trip back to this door over here. So we have several choices, but let's go from here, from this view, we'll go clockwise. So we can go down the stairs, out through the back here, go all the way around the long way towards this building, go through the building, come out the other side, and then make our way back in through this door, and then we can go up the stairs, and then pretty soon we'll be back where we started, back here, right? That's how you should be imagining your level design for multiplayer maps. That's how pretty much you can make it fair for both sides. Okay, so I've pretty much covered, well, I've recapped a little bit on the basics, the absolute basics for multiplayer. If you want to know a little bit more, there's a more in-depth video floating around on my channel somewhere. Be sure to check that out, but for now, let's move on to the actual build process. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at my build process, and if you haven't already noticed, I'm using significantly more meshes than I did in the first half of the video. That's because I have a perfectly legitimate reason for doing that. It's because at this stage, it's still all freehand, pretty much. Nothing is certain at this stage. It's so early in the design process that I want to be able to make quick changes, and by having smaller meshes, yes, it does take time to sort of build a scene, but if you create your static mesh design kit properly, so in this case the biggest floor span that I've got is 6 by 6 units. Just as a reminder, Unity uses metric, so be aware. But like I said, the biggest here that I've got is 6 by 6, and it works out because everything here is a perfect square, or with little deviation anyway. Everything's a perfect square, and well, most of the pieces are a perfect square. Anything that isn't a square piece in this, I don't actually scale, but all the square pieces I do end up scaling so that I don't have to look at so many meshes later on. And that's just a personal workflow of mine. You don't have to follow it. In fact, I would say find your own way of using static mesh for level design, because at the end of the day, it's all about what works for you. If it works for you, use it, because it's uniquely yours. It's a skill that you can take anywhere. When it comes to static meshes, it's a skill that you can use in the Blender game engine. It's a skill that you can use in Unreal, in CryEngine. Really, it's a handy skill to have, using static meshes to build a level. In addition, if you're using a custom engine, so an engine not made by a third party, so maybe, I don't know, maybe you have a really cool programmer as part of your team and they've decided to write up an engine, you will likely not have a BSP system. And if you do, that's awesome. Unity doesn't have a built-in BSP system, so I'm not using Unity BSP plugins. In fact, I don't think the Unity Asset Store has a proper BSP system, or at least a BSP system that can go up against Unreal's BSP or CSG system. CSG, if you were wondering, CSG and BSP are actually two different things. Technically speaking, they're two different things, but they're used sort of to define the same thing. They're basically used to, let's say, interchangeably, even though one's different to the other. I guess that's just how terms evolve. But like I said, when it comes to building levels here in Unity, I prefer to use static meshes, scalable static meshes at that. And yeah, it's far more convenient for me. I work faster with using static meshes here in Unity because I don't have to do so much fiddling around, really. And I can use it for other things too. So even in Unreal Engine, where I would use BSP to do most of my level design, I might put in a static mesh here and there to fill in a blank, because sometimes I want to have a pre-made wall, just wall with windows or wall with a doorway, good to go. I don't have to do any more cutting and all that re-rendering stuff. I can just completely ignore that and just have a wall straight away. And that's my primary reason why I don't use BSP. Oh, another reason why I don't use BSP here in Unity, apart from the fact that there is no BSP native, is because, well, what if you were using an engine that didn't have BSP native? Like, again, custom engine, right? Well, what are you going to do then? You'd be stuck with a workflow that's BSP specific, and if you can't adapt to whatever studio you're working at, if you can't adapt to their workflow, it's going to be a big problem, and you might not be on the project for very long. So while BSP is definitely, I would say that BSP is definitely a faster way to build levels, still having this sort of skill, this background knowledge, will definitely help. It looks good on your resume, at least. Okay, what am I doing here? Right, I'm adding in windows now because you notice that I built the entire building. Basically, it was a giant shoebox when it started. Again, that's another personal workflow. It's really something that I prefer to do. I prefer to block in the entire building before I start adding windows in. And that's pretty much just fall off from my BSP sort of building technique. Because what I do in BSP is, in Unreal Engine, is I build the whole thing first. Not the whole thing, like a whole area first, and then I start carving in doors and windows into the walls, basically. Same thing goes with stairs and things like that. So I start with a box. I start with a shoebox, really. Now, this being a multiplayer level, competitive multiplayer that is, you want to complement gameplay. So if you are creating a level and it's not actually going into a game, so maybe you're doing it for your folio, at least have some ideas to what kind of gameplay you're looking at. So for this, with the re-release of The Last of Us, I decided to go with a Last of Us style gameplay. So slow, methodical, hence the heavy use of cover. There's a lot of cover in the first half of the video. There was a lot of cover points. That's why all the windows here are slightly, they're not all the way to the ground, so that you can actually take cover behind them and use them to your advantage. And for this, I actually skipped one crucial element of level design, and that's the lighting. I do have one sunlight, but the way I saw it is I should have put in at least point lights into the rooms so that I at least knew what was what, because it was really difficult to see when I was playtesting. So when you're building your own levels, definitely don't ignore the principles of level design. I'll post up a video very soon outlining those basic principles, so make sure to check them out when it does get posted. Okay, so now I'm actually working on the props, and I get really picky when it comes to stand-in props. If I don't have a pre-made prop, like these shelves, I imagine them to be like bookshelves. When I don't have a piece already made, I just fall back onto the on using pieces, prop pieces that I've already made, and I'm just combine them with primitives from the game engine. Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's going to get replaced anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now here, I'm doing a lot of weird spacing things. What I actually did was I actually did I think half an hour worth of playtesting to get through the aisles, and make sure that I could fit at least two and a half player sort of modules, player capsules through the aisles. That was the goal. Another thing about multiplayer that I should have mentioned is that actually this is more of a general level design sort of theory again, is make sure that you know what the level's about, what the theme of the game is, especially for multiplayer, because well, it's not so much for multiplayer, but make sure that when you are building a level, it maintains the ethos. So it maintains the theme, the overall theme of the game. So again, mine was this post-apocalyptic, The Last of Us style kind of world. So everything's run down, everything sort of, it looks abandoned, and it's sort of hasn't been maintained, hasn't been kept clean, and things like that. So that's how I imagined it, and that's why I've got all these props sort of scattered around, but inside the buildings, so everything sort of seems intact. And again, without proper playtesting, that is without an actual multiplayer match going on, I can't really say if this is properly balanced or not. Now, back to my build process, actually. If you notice in the first video, and I know I've already said this, but if you notice in the first half of the video, the meshes were larger. I just want to reiterate that it's a lot easier for me, personally, to actually work with smaller meshes and then scale them once I have a more solid design. Again, with multiplayer theory, you want to take into account the fact that there are several things going on in the world that you need to take into account, like level flow and things like that. So if you're starting out, I don't think multiplayer maps would be the best way to go. I'm speaking from personal experience, because when I first started building levels, I built a multiplayer map. It was very boxy, very equal, and not equal in a fun way. I mean, like, quite literally, one side was almost the same as the other side, and that's not fun. If you know what the other side already sort of kinda looks like, it's no fun at all. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding in props, but I'm sort of adding them in a way that both complements the gameplay but still makes sense in the context of the building. Now, that can be very difficult to achieve, so the only way that you can get better at that is through practice. That's all I'm gonna say. Practice, practice, practice. And I'm just cleaning things up. Alright, we're done. Okay, so now that we've covered pretty much today's topics, let's have a quick recap. The first thing is balancing. How very important balancing is to a multiplayer map. That means even spacing, or at least the illusion of even spacing, and giving every player on both teams equal opportunities to encounter the enemy. So let's check that off. That's the first thing we covered. The next thing, level flow. Remember how I said that imagine your multiplayer map like it's a circle, that it shouldn't end? Well, that's essentially what the level flow for most multiplayer maps should be, or at least multiplayer competitive multiplayer maps, that is. So let's check that off too. The next one, gameplay pace and complementing gameplay. I know I didn't touch on that much, but hopefully you did pick up on it, and that basically means that you should build your level to match the gameplay. So ensure that when you are building something, that you have all the programming done first. Let's check that off. And finally, solid design kits. Now, I should warn you that even though you may have a good design kit, it might not always be enough. So be prepared to make changes and additions to your current design kit, because when you do use it again in the future, at least then you'll have a lot more pieces to work with. And more importantly, you should create a design kit that best suits your workflow. So let's check that off too. Now that we've covered all the points that we needed to cover, well, it's the end of the video, isn't it? I really don't know what I'm going to be doing for the next video. However, I can tell you that I'm going to do my best to recreate the second video that I made, which was for adventure games. However, I'm going to try and use Unreal for that video. I'll see how I go. But until then, hopefully you learned something on the topics of multiplayer level design. And please don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section below. Until next time, however, I'll see you all later, guys. Bye.